While my family was laughing about kicking me out of Christmas dinner because I was just a burden, I was quietly sitting on a $6.3 million emergency response company that the Red Cross called for their most dangerous missions. When they locked me out in a Colorado blizzard thinking I'd come crawling back, they discovered the helpless veteran they threw into the snow was a Special Forces survival expert. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, and this is how my family learned you don't throw a survival expert into a snowstorm. Christmas Eve at the Brennan house was like stepping into a Norman Rockwell painting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you that someone had poisoned with cruelty. My stepmother Diane arranged the holly centerpieces with the precision of someone who believed appearance mattered more than substance. My stepfather Frank carved the ham while telling stories about his latest promotion to district manager at the insurance company, making sure everyone knew how much his Christmas bonus was this year. My stepbrother Kyle live-streamed himself opening early presents to his TikTok followers, occasionally pausing to complain about having to share Christmas with extras. And then there was me, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, the unwanted reminder that Frank's perfect second family came with complications from his wife's previous marriage. "So Becca," Frank said without looking up from his carving, "still living in that tiny place by the mountains? When are you going to get serious about your living situation?" "It suits my needs," I replied, cutting into my sweet potatoes. "Suits your needs." He repeated it like the words had a bad taste. "You're 36 years old. Most women your age have established careers, families, homes worth talking about." Kyle looked up from his phone long enough to add, "At least she's not asking for money anymore. That's something, right, Dad?" The familiar silence settled over the table like a blanket of thorns. Diane shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but she'd learned years ago that defending me only made Frank more aggressive about what he called reality checks. "I have a career," I said quietly. "That consulting thing doesn't count as a real career, Becca. Running around playing survivalist for corporate team-building exercises isn't what successful women do." What he didn't know was that my quote-tune thing was actually Torres Emergency Response, the company I'd built from nothing after leaving the military. What he couldn't see was that every time I came home to my tiny mountain place, I was coordinating rescue operations for natural disasters, training first responders for extreme situations, and managing contracts with organizations that called me when situations became too dangerous for anyone else. But explaining that would require him to listen, and Frank Brennan had stopped listening to me the day I came home from Afghanistan with PTSD and what he called an attitude problem. "You know what your issue is, Becca?" he continued, settling into his favorite lecture topic. "You never learned how to be a normal woman. Military service messed you up, made you think you could do men's jobs. Now you're stuck playing dress-up instead of settling down like you should have." "That's enough," I said, standing up. "Is it? Because someone needs to tell you the truth. You're 36, single, living like a college student, pretending to be some kind of action hero. It's embarrassing for the whole family." I walked toward the coat closet, my hands steady despite the familiar burning in my chest. Behind me, I could hear Diane's voice, weak and apologetic. "Becca, please stay. It's Christmas Eve. He doesn't mean—" "Yes, I do mean it." Frank's voice followed me to the hallway. "And here's something else that needs saying. This family would be better off without your drama. You're not really our responsibility anyway." Kyle laughed from the dining room. "Let's see if she can actually survive on her own for once." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good point. Becca, why don't you spend Christmas somewhere else this year? Maybe learn what the real world is like without family support." I stopped with my hand on the door handle. Outside, snow was falling heavily, and the temperature was dropping toward 0. They were literally kicking me out into a blizzard on Christmas Eve. For a moment, I considered telling them exactly who they were dismissing. But instead, I opened the door and stepped out into the Colorado snow. What Frank Brennan didn't know was that the failed woman he'd just thrown into a snowstorm had spent the last month training Navy SEALs for Arctic survival. But he was about to learn. The blizzard hit with full force as I walked to my truck, but the cold didn't bother me the way it should have. 22 degrees below zero, with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour, conditions that would send most people into panic mode. For me, it was just another Tuesday compared to the survival training I'd been conducting in Alaska last month. Next up, my encrypted satellite phone buzzed as I started the engine. A message from Jake Martinez, my business partner and former Special Forces brother. Christmas Eve rescue in Nepal approved. Avalanche-trapped international climbing team. They're requesting you personally for extraction. Helicopter deployment in 18 hours. I typed back, send coordinates and weather data. As I drove through the mountain roads that Frank thought were too dangerous for a woman to navigate alone, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. To most people, I looked exactly like what Frank saw. Someone who'd been through too much, carrying invisible damage from military service. The small scar above my left eyebrow from the helicopter crash in Kandahar was barely visible unless you knew where to look. What they couldn't see was everything else. My tiny mountain place was actually a 2,000-square-foot cabin on 40 acres of private land, custom-built for emergency response operations. I'd bought the property outright 3 years ago, with proceeds from a single FEMA contract. The cabin housed a communications center that could coordinate rescue operations across multiple continents. I pulled into my driveway and activated the security system that most government facilities would envy. Inside, I dropped my keys on the kitchen island and checked the priority alerts on my communication array. New hardware had arrived from our supplier in Norway. Cold weather rescue equipment designed for operations in conditions most people couldn't imagine surviving. In my world, extreme weather wasn't an obstacle. It was just another variable to calculate and overcome. I'd learned that lesson in Afghanistan, where a single miscalculation about environmental conditions could get an entire rescue team killed. I powered up my secure laptop network and logged into the servers that housed Torres Emergency Response. On paper, Jake and I were equal partners, but the operational reality was more complex. I handled field operations and extreme environment rescues, the work that required both military special operations experience and expertise in disaster response. Jake managed logistics and client relations, the coordination that required business acumen and crisis communication skills. Tonight's mission queue contained the usual mix: avalanche rescue in Nepal, earthquake response team deployment to Turkey, and an urgent request from the Coast Guard for assistance with a ship trapped in Arctic ice. Each operation represented weeks of preparation, equipment coordination, and risk assessment that could mean the difference between successful rescue and tragic loss. The Nepal contract Jake mentioned was typical of our highest-risk work. An international climbing expedition had been caught in an unexpected avalanche, requiring helicopter extraction in conditions that had already grounded local rescue services. 18 hours to deploy equipment, coordinate with Nepalese authorities, and execute a rescue operation in weather that most pilots considered impossible. It was the kind of work that required someone who understood both high-altitude physiology and military extraction protocols. Someone who could plan helicopter operations while calculating avalanche risk factors in real time. Frank Brennan saw a failed woman playing survivalist games. International rescue organizations saw something very different. "Me here." My secure line rang. Jake's encrypted number appeared on the display. "How did Christmas dinner go?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the outcome. "Frank kicked me out into a blizzard because I'm apparently a burden who can't handle real life." "Well, while you were getting lectured about being a proper woman, I got a call from our contact at FEMA. They want us to lead the emergency response team for the new Pacific Earthquake Preparedness Initiative." I pulled up the preliminary specifications on my monitor. $38 million over 2 years. The kind of contract that would establish us as the premier emergency response firm for natural disasters. What's the deployment timeline? First phase starts next month. But Becca, this is Major League Disaster Response. We're talking about coordinating rescue operations for scenarios that could affect millions of people. After hanging up, I stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the mountain wilderness where I'd chosen to build my life. Somewhere in the valley below, Frank was probably telling Diane how I'd never amount to anything significant. How military service had ruined whatever potential I might have had. What he didn't know was that tomorrow morning, I'd be briefing international rescue coordinators about high-altitude emergency response protocols while he filed insurance paperwork. Some truths were too dangerous to share with people who measured success by suburban comfort and Christmas bonuses. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of pristine silence that only comes after a major snowstorm. I stood in my gear room selecting between 4 sets of specialized equipment, each designed for different types of extreme operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Arctic rescue gear for today's Nepal deployment, the earthquake response kit for urban disaster scenarios, the mountain rescue equipment for high-altitude operations, or the flood response gear for water-based emergencies. I chose the Arctic kit, high-altitude avalanche rescue required equipment that could function in conditions that killed most technology. Behind my gear wall, concealed behind a biometric scanner and reinforced titanium door, lay the command center of my operation. The hidden room wasn't large, maybe 12 by 15 feet, but it contained enough advanced communication equipment, weather monitoring systems, and emergency coordination technology to run disaster response operations across multiple continents simultaneously. 8 high-definition monitors displayed real-time emergency situations across different time zones. A Turkish earthquake with survivors trapped in collapsed buildings, a North Sea oil rig dealing with storm damage and potential evacuations, and a mountain rescue operation in the Swiss Alps, where my custom safety protocols had just prevented a secondary avalanche. All under Torres emergency response oversight, all monitored from my Colorado mountain cabin that Frank thought was a quote, waste of money on impractical isolation. The priority communication system rang as I was reviewing overnight incident reports. Nepal emergency frequency. Becca, we have a critical update. Jake's voice was tight with urgency. The climbing team in Nepal just reported a second avalanche. We now have 12 people trapped instead of 6, and weather conditions are deteriorating faster than projected. I pulled up the Nepal operation file on my primary monitor. Mount Everest climbing expedition, mixed international team including 3 emergency medical personnel who'd been attempting a winter ascent. 4 days ago, I'd personally approved their safety protocols and provided emergency communication equipment that could function at extreme altitude. Casualty status? I asked, already accessing real-time satellite weather data for the region. 2 confirmed injuries, 1 critical. Local rescue services have been grounded for 36 hours due to weather. We're the only team with equipment rated for these conditions. My fingers moved across multiple keyboards simultaneously, coordinating helicopter deployment schedules, medical supply requirements, and international clearance protocols. This was what Frank Brennan would never understand. While he was processing insurance claims for suburban fender benders, I was literally coordinating life-or-death rescue operations in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Deploying Extraction Protocol Alpha 9, I said, activating our most advanced high-altitude rescue procedures. Medical team airborne in 4 hours. Copy that. Becca, this operation is being monitored by international rescue organizations. If we pull this off in these conditions, we're looking at contract opportunities worth over $60 million. After coordinating the Nepal deployment, I opened my laptop to review financial statements that would have made Frank's insurance district manager salary look like pocket change. Torres emergency response had grossed $84 million in the past 18 months. My personal account with First National Private Banking showed a balance that fluctuated between $6 and $8 million, depending on active operations and equipment investments. This morning's automatic deposits included $4.2 million from the completed Turkish earthquake response, $1.8 million from ongoing North Sea operations, and $950,000 from the Swiss avalanche prevention system I'd designed. Just another Christmas morning in my world. I maintained a backup operations center in Switzerland, an equipment depot in Alaska, and owned a helicopter maintenance facility in Montana under a subsidiary corporation. My specialized rescue equipment inventory, stored in climate-controlled facilities across 3 states, was worth more than most small towns' entire emergency budgets. The irony was crystalline. Frank Brennan spent his days calculating insurance payouts for minor accidents while lecturing me about financial responsibility. Meanwhile, I had contracts pending that would earn me more in 3 months than he'd make in his entire career. My phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. "Hope you didn't freeze to death out there, LOL. Dad says you're probably crying somewhere begging someone to help you." I stared at the message for a long moment. At that exact moment, I was coordinating a rescue operation that would save 12 lives in conditions that had already defeated every other rescue organization in the region. I typed back. Thanks for checking on me, currently handling some work situations. As I hit send, I realized that Frank Brennan was about to discover that the burden he'd thrown into a blizzard on Christmas Eve had spent Christmas morning saving lives in Nepal while he was opening presents. Some education was worth the dramatic timing. 4 days passed in relative quiet. The Nepal rescue was executed flawlessly. All 12 climbers extracted safely despite conditions that had grounded every other rescue service in the region. International media coverage was extensive, though my name wasn't mentioned per our standard operational security protocols. The FEMA earthquake preparedness contract was approved, securing our operations funding for the next 2 years. I was reviewing avalanche prediction models for a ski resort safety consultation when my personal phone erupted with an unexpected call. The caller ID showed a Colorado Springs area code, but something felt wrong. In my line of work, calls from unknown local numbers usually meant someone had discovered information they weren't supposed to have. Lieutenant Colonel Torres, I answered. Miss Torres, this is Captain Janet Hughes from the Colorado National Guard Emergency Response Division. I'm calling because we have a developing situation that requires immediate specialist consultation. My blood went cold. The National Guard didn't make casual Christmas week phone calls. What kind of situation? We have a family of 5 trapped in their vehicle approximately 12 miles northeast of Breckenridge. They've been missing for 18 hours following yesterday's avalanche activity. Local search and rescue teams have been unable to reach the area due to extreme weather conditions and continued avalanche danger. I pulled up topographical maps of the Breckenridge area on my computer. The region they were describing was notoriously dangerous, with avalanche zones that required specialized expertise to navigate safely. Why are you calling me specifically? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Your name came up in our database as the only civilian contractor in Colorado with both military special operations experience and advanced avalanche rescue certification. We've been monitoring your company's recent rescue operations, including the Nepal extraction that concluded yesterday. My throat tightened. The National Guard had been tracking my operations, which meant they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. What's the family's last known location? That's where this gets complicated. The family name is Brennan. Frank Brennan, his wife Diane, and 3 family members including a young adult named Kyle. The world stopped. Frank, Diane, Kyle. My family, the same people who'd kicked me out into a blizzard 4 days ago, were now trapped in an avalanche zone, and I was the only person qualified to reach them. Miss Torres, are you still there? I'm here, I managed. What's their condition? Unknown. Their vehicle went off-road during the storm, likely attempting to reach their cabin. Cell phone contact was lost approximately 3 a.m. this morning. Temperature dropped to -30 last night. I closed my eyes and tried to process what I was hearing. Frank, who'd called me a burden and thrown me out on Christmas Eve, was now trapped in exactly the kind of extreme conditions I specialized in surviving. The irony was almost too much to comprehend. Captain Hughes, I need complete GPS coordinates, current weather data, and satellite imagery of the area. I'm sending everything now. Ms. Torres, I should mention, time is critical. In these temperatures, survival time is extremely limited, even with vehicle shelter. As the data flooded my screens, I realized the full scope of what had happened. Frank's cabin getaway after Christmas had turned into a disaster when they'd attempted to drive through an area I could have told them was impassable. They were trapped in a location where rescue attempts had killed professional teams. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Diane. Kyle gave me your number. We're in trouble. Frank is hurt. Please help us. Another message. I'm sorry about Christmas Eve. Please don't let us die out here. I stared at the messages for several seconds. The same people who'd laughed about throwing me into a blizzard were now begging for help from the woman they'd called a burden. My encrypted phone rang. Jake's number. Becca, I just got a call from the National Guard. They want us for an emergency extraction, but when I heard the name Brennan, "It's them," I said quietly. "My family." "Jesus, what do you want to do?" I looked out at the mountain wilderness where I'd built my expertise while they built their assumptions about my worth. "Get the helicopter ready," I said. "We have people to save." The Colorado National Guard base at Peterson Space Force Base felt like stepping into a war movie when I arrived 90 minutes later. Military vehicles lined the tarmac, their engines running against the sub-zero temperatures. Emergency response personnel moved with urgent precision, their breath visible in the frigid air. In the center of it all sat my rescue helicopter, a modified Black Hawk equipped with specialized high-altitude rescue equipment. Captain Hughes met me at the aircraft, her face grim with command decisions. "Miss Torres, we've had no contact with the Brennan family for 6 hours. Satellite thermal imaging shows their vehicle, but we can't determine if there are survivors." I climbed into the helicopter and began checking my equipment. Arctic survival gear rated for -40 temperatures, avalanche rescue equipment that could locate victims buried under 20 feet of snow, and medical supplies designed for hypothermia treatment. This was gear I'd tested in Alaska, perfected in Nepal, and used to save lives in conditions that killed other rescue teams. "What's the approach route?" I asked, studying the topographical maps. "That's the problem," Captain Hughes replied. "The entire area is an active avalanche zone. We've lost 2 local rescue teams trying to reach that location in the past 18 months. Our pilots are refusing to fly the mission." I looked at the assembled National Guard personnel, men and women trained for disaster response, all shaking their heads at a mission they considered impossible. "Captain, I need to speak with your meteorologist." 5 minutes later, I was studying real-time weather data with expertise that made the National Guard specialists step back in amazement. Wind patterns, temperature gradients, snow stability analysis. I was reading conditions like a language these military professionals had never learned. "The avalanche danger is highest along standard approach routes," I explained, highlighting areas on the digital map. "But there's a window here, following this ridgeline, where we can avoid the primary slide zones." "Miss Torres," the chief meteorologist interrupted, "that approach requires flying through wind shear that exceeds safety parameters for helicopter operations." "Not for a pilot with Special Forces high-altitude experience," I replied calmly. "I've flown this exact profile in Afghanistan under combat conditions." The silence in the briefing room was absolute. Captain Hughes stared at me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and awe. "You're pilot qualified for this aircraft?" "I'm qualified for aircraft most people have never heard of," I said, pulling out my military aviation credentials. "Special Operations Command, rotary wing pilot, high altitude and extreme weather certified." The rescue coordinator whispered to his colleague, "She's not just a consultant. She's the real deal." An hour later, I was at the controls of the Black Hawk, flying through conditions that had defeated every other rescue attempt. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour, visibility near zero, and temperature readings that would kill most aircraft engines. But this wasn't just any aircraft. It was military-grade equipment operated by someone who'd learned to fly in war zones. My radio crackled, "Torres, this is base. We're showing wind shear that should be grounding you. Copy that, base. Conditions are manageable with appropriate technique." 15 minutes later, I spotted the overturned SUV half buried in snow at the bottom of a ravine. Thermal imaging confirmed multiple heat signatures. They were alive, but barely. I set the helicopter down on a landing zone I'd calculated in real time, accounting for wind patterns and snow stability. As I approached the vehicle with rescue equipment, I could see faces pressed against the windows. Frank's face went white when he recognized me through the snow gear. Kyle started crying. Diane was unconscious but breathing. "Frank," I said, opening the vehicle door, "this is Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, United States Army Special Forces. I'm here to take you home." His mouth moved but no sound came out. The man who'd called me a burden was staring at the woman who'd just performed a helicopter rescue that had defeated every other team in Colorado. "We need to move fast," I continued. "Hypothermia protocols require immediate evacuation." As I began loading them into the helicopter, Frank grabbed my arm. "Becca, I had no idea. How did you—" "I'll explain everything once we get you to safety," I replied. Right now, we need to fly." 20 minutes later, we touched down at the National Guard medical facility. As paramedics took over care of my family, Captain Hughes approached me. "Ms. Torres, that was the most impressive rescue operation I've witnessed in 15 years of emergency response." I looked back at Frank, who was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. 3 hours later, I walked into the medical facility's family waiting room, where Frank sat with his head in his hands. Kyle paced nervously by the windows, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like shock. Diane was stable but still unconscious, receiving treatment for severe hypothermia. The doctors had said she'd survive, but it had been close. Frank looked up when I entered, and for the first time in the years I'd known him, he looked small, vulnerable. Nothing like the commanding presence who dominated every family gathering with his insurance success stories. "Becca," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the doctors told us what you did. They said no other pilot in Colorado would have attempted that rescue." I sat down across from him, still wearing my flight suit with the Special Forces insignia clearly visible. "How are you feeling?" "I don't understand," Kyle interrupted, his voice cracking. "Becca, you flew a military helicopter. You're a pilot? When did this happen?" "I've been a pilot for 12 years, Kyle. Army Special Forces, combat rotations in Afghanistan and Iraq." Frank stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "But you said you did consulting work. Survivalist training for corporate teams." "I do consulting work for the Department of Defense, FEMA, and international rescue organizations. The corporate team building was a cover story, because you made it clear you weren't interested in hearing about my actual career." A nurse approached us with a clipboard. "Excuse me, are you Lieutenant Colonel Torres?" "I am." "The hospital administrator wanted me to thank you personally. He said your emergency medical protocols during the rescue saved Mrs. Brennan's life. He's never seen hypothermia treatment executed so precisely in field conditions." After the nurse left, Frank looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and confusion. "Becca, I don't know what to say. When Captain Hughes briefed us about the rescue, she said you're one of the most qualified emergency response specialists in the country. You called me a burden 4 days ago," I said quietly. "You threw me out in a blizzard because I couldn't handle real life." Kyle sank into a chair, his face red with what might have been shame. "We almost died out there. The car went off the road, and we couldn't get cell service. When the temperature dropped, I thought..." "You thought what?" "I thought we were going to freeze to death. And the whole time, I kept thinking about how we treated you on Christmas Eve. How we'd laughed about throwing you out in the snow." Frank ran his hands through his hair. "The National Guard captain said you have the highest level of security clearance, that your company has contracts with government agencies I've never heard of. Torres Emergency Response has grossed over $80 million in the past 18 months, I said. "We coordinate disaster relief operations worldwide. Last month, I briefed Pentagon officials about earthquake preparedness protocols." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Frank kept staring at my flight suit, at the military insignia that marked me as someone he'd never bothered to see. "All those times you traveled," he said slowly. "All those phone calls we thought were job interviews. I was coordinating rescue operations, saving lives in conditions that kill professional rescue teams." Kyle looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Becca, I posted about you on social media. I called you a failure. I said you were the family embarrassment. I know, but you still came to save us." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where I'd built my expertise while they built their assumptions about my worth. "Your family, Kyle. Saving people is what I do." Frank's voice was barely audible. "We treated you like garbage and you risked your life to save us." "Yes." "Why?" I turned back to face him. "Because despite everything you said to me, I'm not the person you thought I was. I never was." A doctor appeared in the doorway. "The Brennan family. Your wife is awake and asking for everyone." As we walked toward Diane's room, Frank stopped me. "Becca, how do we apologize for 3 years of being completely wrong about who you are?" "We'll figure that out," I said. "But first, let's make sure Diane knows she's safe." Diane's hospital room felt like neutral territory as we gathered around her bed. She was awake but weak, her face pale from the hypothermia treatment. When she saw me in my flight suit, her eyes filled with tears. "Becca," she whispered, "the nurses told me you saved our lives. They said you flew through a blizzard that had grounded every other pilot in Colorado." I pulled a chair closer to her bed. "How are you feeling?" "Confused," she said, looking at Frank and then back at me. "The doctor said you performed advanced medical procedures during the rescue. He called it military-level trauma care." Frank cleared his throat, his voice still unsteady. "Diane, we need to tell you what we've learned. Becca isn't who we thought she was." "What do you mean?" I opened my laptop and showed her the Torres emergency response website. "This is my company. Jake Martinez and I founded it 3 years ago after I left active military service. We provide emergency response and disaster relief services worldwide." Diane stared at the screen, scrolling through photos of rescue operations, client testimonials, and team profiles. My official bio showed me in military dress uniform, with a list of qualifications that read like something from an action movie. "Special Forces?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Army Special Operations Command. 3 combat deployments, pilot certification for multiple aircraft types, and specialized training in extreme environment survival and rescue operations." Kyle, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "Becca, when you said you did corporate consulting, we thought you meant like trust-building exercises and rope climbing." "I do corporate consulting for Fortune 500 companies that need disaster preparedness training, emergency response protocols, and executive protection services in hostile environments." Frank was reading through the website with growing amazement. "It says here you've coordinated rescue operations in 12 countries. You've worked with NATO forces, international relief organizations, and government agencies. Last month, I led a joint operation with Swiss Rescue Services to extract a research team trapped by an avalanche in the Alps. The month before that, I coordinated earthquake response efforts in Turkey that saved over 200 lives." Diane reached for my hand. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years, we thought you were struggling to find direction after the military. Because every time I tried to explain my work, you dismissed it. Every time I mentioned contracts or deployments, Frank reduced it to playing soldier or pretending to be important." "But this is incredible," Diane continued, tears streaming down her face. "You're protecting people, saving lives. This is meaningful work. More meaningful than processing insurance claims," I said, looking directly at Frank. He winced. "Becca, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give. When I called you a burden, when I said you couldn't handle real life, you were talking about someone you never bothered to get to know." I pulled up our financial statements on another screen. Torres Emergency Response grossed $84 million last year. We have 42 full-time employees and contracts with government agencies in 16 countries. This isn't a hobby or a phase. It's a career built on expertise you refuse to acknowledge. Kyle stared at the numbers. 84 million? Becca, you're successful, despite your constant predictions that I'd fail. Frank stood up and walked to the window, his shoulders sagging. "All those times I lectured you about getting a real job, about being responsible, about contributing to society. You were lecturing someone who was literally contributing to international security and disaster relief." Diane squeezed my hand. "The mountain cabin where you live, is that where you coordinate all this? It's a fully equipped emergency response center. I chose that location specifically because it allows me to test equipment and protocols in extreme conditions." "The conditions that saved our lives today," Frank said quietly. "Yes." He turned back to face me. "Becca, I don't know how to process this. For 3 years I've been treating you like a failure while you were building something extraordinary. I stopped needing your approval a long time ago, Frank. But I never stopped being family." Kyle wiped his eyes. "You could have let us die out there, after everything we said to you." "No," I replied firmly, "I couldn't. That's not who I am." Diane looked at all of us. "So what happens now? How do we move forward from this?" I closed my laptop and looked at each of them. "We start over. With honesty this time." The silence in Diane's hospital room felt different now. Not the uncomfortable tension I'd grown accustomed to during family gatherings, but something softer, more fragile. Diane continued holding my hand like she was afraid I might disappear again. while Frank stood by the window processing everything he'd learned. "Becca," Frank finally said, turning to face me, "I need to say something, and I don't know if I can find the right words." I waited, watching him struggle with emotions he'd never shown before. "I was wrong, completely, utterly wrong about who you are and what you've accomplished. I convinced myself I was being realistic about your prospects, but I was just—" His voice cracked. "I was being cruel." Diane looked up at him, then at me. "We both failed you, Becca. When you came home from the military, you were trying to find your path, and instead of supporting you through that transition, we treated you like a problem that needed fixing." "You weren't wrong to be concerned," I said, settling back in my chair. "I was struggling when I first came home. PTSD, adjustment issues, uncertainty about civilian careers. But I found my way, and you never gave me credit for rebuilding myself." "Because we never saw it happening," Diane whispered. "All those trips, all those phone calls, all those times you seemed so confident and composed. We thought you were putting on a brave face." Kyle, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "I made TikTok videos about you. Mocking videos. I called you the family failure and got thousands of likes making fun of your career." "I know about the videos, Kyle." His face went red. "You knew? And you still saved my life?" "You're my stepbrother. Your social media posts don't define our relationship." Frank walked over to where I was sitting. "Becca, how do we repair this? How do we come back from years of treating you like you didn't matter?" "By seeing me for who I really am going forward." Diane reached for a tissue with her free hand. "Tell us about your work. Really tell us. I want to understand what you do, what you've built." For the next hour, I walked them through the reality of my professional life. I showed them photos from operations I could legally discuss, rescue training facilities in Alaska, coordination meetings with international relief organizations, the specialized equipment I developed for extreme weather operations. I explained how military training translated into civilian emergency response, how the skills I'd learned in combat zones made me valuable to organizations facing real disasters. The avalanche rescue I coordinated in Switzerland last month, I told them, required working with 4 different national rescue services and deploying equipment that can function at altitudes where most technology fails. That's the level of complexity I handle routinely. Frank listened with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine interest mixed with something that might have been pride. The strategic planning, the international coordination, the life-or-death decision-making, that's not amateur survivalist training. No. It's emergency response at the highest levels of government and international relief work. It requires someone who can think tactically under extreme pressure and execute flawlessly when lives depend on it. "Like a military operation," Diane said with growing understanding. "Exactly like military operations. Except instead of combat objectives, I'm coordinating rescue missions and disaster relief." Kyle showed me his phone. "I want to delete those videos about you. All of them. I feel sick knowing they're still out there." "Don't delete them," I said. "Keep them as reminders that people aren't always what they appear to be." Frank sat down beside Diane's bed. "Becca, I don't know how to apologize for years of being blind to your accomplishments, but I want to try to earn back your respect. I don't need you to see me as a hero, Frank. I just need you to see me as someone who found her purpose and succeeded at it." "More than succeeded," Diane said softly. "You've built something extraordinary while we were too stubborn to notice." "And you saved our lives," Kyle added, his voice thick with emotion. I looked at each of them, these people who'd made me feel like a failure while I was building something meaningful. "I didn't save you because I wanted to prove a point. I saved you because you're family, and that's what I do." Frank extended his hand to me. "Can we start over?" When I shook it, it felt like the beginning of something completely different. 8 weeks later, I stood on the stage at the Denver Convention Center, addressing the annual International Emergency Response Summit. The auditorium was packed with disaster relief professionals, military specialists, and government officials from around the world. Behind me, a massive screen displayed the Torres Emergency Response logo and footage from our recent operations, including the Christmas Eve rescue that had made national news. In the front row, I could see my family. Diane wore the navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, her face glowing with pride. Frank sat beside her in his best suit, holding a program with my photo on the cover, this time showing me in full rescue gear against a mountain backdrop. Kyle was documenting everything with his phone, but now for proud social media posts instead of mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator announced, "please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, CEO and founder of Torres Emergency Response, and this year's recipient of the International Humanitarian Rescue Award." The standing ovation was thunderous as I stepped up to the microphone. 2 months ago, my family had thought I was a burden who couldn't handle real life. Today, I was being recognized as one of the most accomplished emergency response specialists in the world. "Thank you," I began, waiting for the applause to subside. 2 months ago, I performed a rescue operation that changed my life in ways I never expected. Not because of the technical challenges or the extreme conditions, but because of who I was rescuing. I clicked to the first slide, showing before and after photos of the Christmas Eve operation, satellite images of the blizzard conditions, and footage of the successful evacuation. Emergency response work teaches you that disasters don't discriminate. They don't care about your family dynamics, your personal relationships, or your past conflicts. When lives are at stake, you respond with everything you have. The audience of rescue professionals nodded in recognition. These were people who understood the weight of life or death decisions, the burden of carrying skills that could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. Torres Emergency Response has grown from a 2-person startup to a 42-employee organization with global reach. This year, we've coordinated rescue operations in 18 countries, prevented dozens of potential disasters, and saved over 300 lives in extreme conditions. Frank's eyes widened at the numbers. Even after our reconciliation, he was still discovering the full scope of what I'd accomplished. But the most important lesson I've learned isn't about technical expertise or operational success. It's about the power of being consistently underestimated. When people expect nothing from you, every achievement becomes extraordinary. I clicked to a slide showing some of our team members, all veterans, all highly trained specialists who'd found their calling in emergency response. To the veterans and first responders in this audience, your skills are more valuable than you realize. The training that prepared you for military service, police work, or firefighting translates directly to disaster relief, emergency coordination, and international rescue operations. Don't let anyone convince you that your experience is outdated. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 4 minutes. As I looked out at the crowd, I saw dozens of professionals who'd struggled with similar challenges, who'd been told their specialized skills weren't relevant in civilian careers. After the speech, during the networking reception, my family mingled with other attendees. I watched Frank deep in conversation with a retired Marine colonel who ran disaster relief operations in Southeast Asia, both discussing the strategic challenges of coordinating international rescue efforts. Diane approached me with tears of pride in her eyes. "Becca, watching you up there, talking about saving lives and preventing disasters. I finally understand what you meant when you said we never asked what you were really building." Kyle posted a video to his social media. "My sister Rebecca just won the International Humanitarian Rescue Award. She's saved over 300 lives and coordinates disaster relief worldwide. I used to call her a failure. I was the failure for not seeing her greatness." The caption read, "Sometimes the people who seem quietest are doing the loudest work in the world. Proud of my incredible sister." Later that evening, as we sat in my mountain cabin overlooking the wilderness where I'd built my expertise, Frank raised his glass. "To Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres," he said with genuine emotion, "the woman who taught us that heroes don't always look like what we expect." 5 months after the awards ceremony, I sat in my command center reviewing applications for the Rebecca Torres Veterans Emergency Response Scholarship. We'd launched it with a $3 million endowment, designed specifically for veterans transitioning into disaster relief and emergency response careers. The applications told stories I recognized intimately, men and women struggling to translate military experience into meaningful civilian work, facing families who didn't understand their potential. One application particularly resonated with me. A former Navy rescue swimmer named Amanda Rodriguez had written, "My family thinks I'm wasting my time pursuing emergency management certifications." They keep telling me to get a, quote, stable office job and stop chasing dangerous work. But I know I have something important to offer. I approved her application immediately and made a note to personally mentor her through the career transition process. My secure phone rang. Frank's number appeared on the encrypted display. "Becca, I hope I'm not interrupting any rescue operations," he said, his tone carrying respect that still felt remarkably new. "Never too busy for family. What's going on?" "I wanted to run something by you. The insurance company is developing new disaster response protocols, and they want expert consultation on emergency preparedness planning. I immediately thought of you." The transformation was profound. The man who'd spent years dismissing my expertise was now actively seeking it out for his own professional advancement. "Send me the project details. I'll review them and see how Torres emergency response can help." "Thank you, Becca. And I wanted you to know, I've been recommending your company to other businesses. I'm proud to tell people about your success." After hanging up, I walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the mountain wilderness, where I'd built everything while being consistently underestimated. The Colorado peaks stretched endlessly under afternoon clouds, and somewhere among those mountains were training sites where I'd developed skills that had saved hundreds of lives. Diane had started volunteering with a veterans transition organization, sharing resources about translating military skills into civilian emergency response careers. Kyle had become an advocate for veteran entrepreneurship on his social media platforms, using his influence to highlight successful veteran-owned businesses and challenge stereotypes about post-military careers. But the most meaningful transformation was in how I viewed myself and my journey. For years, I'd carried the weight of their dismissal, questioning whether I was truly making a difference or just convincing myself. Their inability to see my worth had made me doubt my own path, even as my client list grew to include the most critical emergency response organizations in the world. I'd built a rescue empire while feeling like a family disappointment, achieved extraordinary success while believing I was letting everyone down. The truth was simpler than I'd realized. Their failure to recognize my value didn't diminish my accomplishments. Their inability to understand my calling didn't invalidate the lives I'd saved. I'd spent so much energy trying to prove myself to people who were determined not to see me that I'd forgotten to celebrate what I'd actually built. That evening, Jake called with news about the FEMA contract. "We got the Pacific Earthquake Preparedness contract," he said, excitement clear in his voice. $38 million coordinating disaster response for the entire West Coast. "Becca, this makes us the primary emergency response contractor for natural disasters." "Outstanding. Start assembling the regional coordination teams. I want our best people leading each sector." "Already on it. But Becca, there's something else. The United Nations wants to discuss making us their primary contractor for international disaster relief operations. They're talking about a partnership that could affect millions of people." I smiled, thinking about the Christmas Eve when Frank had thrown me into a blizzard, certain I couldn't handle real-world challenges. Set up the meeting. It's time to take disaster relief to a global scale. As I ended the call, I realized that this story wasn't really about my family learning to see me differently. It was about me learning to value my purpose regardless of whether others could recognize it. The burden they pitied had never existed. The failure they worried about was fiction. The woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar emergency response organization while saving lives across 3 continents. That was who I'd always been. Sometimes the most important person you need to rescue is yourself from other people's limitations. And sometimes, success is simply having the courage to keep saving lives, even when no one's watching. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.